Today's international cinema is Tsotsi from 2005 from South Africa. Now, Tsotsi may be going on a decade old, but it's still very topical in terms of reflecting what's going on in modern South Africa. The film does run about 94 minutes in length. It's in several languages. You won't be able to detect any except maybe some broken English, but you're going to hear Zulu, Xhosa, Afrikaans, and even some English. Now, the film is supposed to take place in a suburb of Johannesburg, South Africa. Johannesburg is a major city, and this suburb is called Soweto. It's just southwest of the city center of Johannesburg. So let's do a nice geographical historical overview here to put it in context of what you're about to see. Now, as I suggested, I don't have to do a whole lot of introduction of the story itself because it's a human drama about a life in modern South Africa. Well, it's life for the lowest, poorest classes of South Africa here in the modern world, which unfortunately is a lot more people than you think. Because we think of South Africa as a pretty rich place, and it is, comparatively speaking, for Africa, and we think of it's a pretty developed place, and it is. But they still have some major issues with poverty, unemployment, wealth disparity, that are making for a very tense situation in modern South Africa. So even though this is a decade old, still quite topical in terms of what you're getting ready to see and the issues at hand. Now, South Africa, of course, is, let me set the geographical stage here, it's the southernmost state in Africa. Don't make the mistake that a former U.S. president did in calling out the great state of Africa. Africa is a continent. South Africa is a sovereign state. It's a sovereign state. It's on the southern tip of the continent of Africa. Geographically speaking, it is about 2 times the size of Texas. Good-sized state. 25th largest country on planet Earth. And a lot of people hear Africa, really they hear anything about Africa, much less South Africa, and they think it's tropical and rainforest and jungle, and yeah, there's big chunks of that in Africa as a continent, but South Africa actually is in the mid-latitudes, is what we call it, 22, 23 to 35 degrees southerly latitude. That puts it in the mid-latitudes. So it's a temperate climate. Lots of Africa is tropical, but not South Africa. It actually has a mixed bag of things like steppe and desert, and they got mountains, so there's montane climates, and there's trees and forest and scrubland and grassland, and even Mediterranean-style climate rimming much of the coastland. I actually think of South Africa in terms of climate and vegetation much like Spain. Yeah, it is. But we're not going to focus on the physical world because most of this film takes place in cityscapes. So you won't see a lot of the physical world. We want to focus more on the people. Let's get to those peeps. South Africa has about 53 million people in it right now. And the ethnic racial background is about 80% what we call black African, about 9 or 10% white, and 9 or 10% something that they call self-defined. Actually, it was a government-defined term in South Africa. They say there's 9 or 10% colored folks in South Africa. Now, for those of you that don't know, the term colored is actually fairly offensive in America, but it is a government-defined term in South Africa, so it's slightly different. It does mean some sort of mixed race between white and black, so lighter-skinned blacks. We put all these folks together, and actually there's 1 or 2% Indian and Asian background folks as well. So you put all this together, and it's one of the reasons why South Africa is called the Rainbow Nation. Bringing together the colors of the rainbow together. That's actually a nice happy-go-lucky spin on what was previously some pretty nasty racist business that ran this country of South Africa for most of the last 100 to 500 years. So the local black Africans, okay, I got that. They're native, for lack of a better term. Where do these white people come from? 10% white? That's a fairly high number for an African state. Well, South Africa started out as in the modern era, it started out as a colony of the Dutch. The Dutch East Indian Company went down there and established a port at Cape Town, another very popular and famous and awesome city of South Africa, and it was a trading post. And then they started to push inward into the interior and take over more land. And then they found gold and diamonds, and then everybody wanted more land. And in fact, and that was in the 1650s is when the Dutch started to take over their Cape Town area. And it was so popular as a trading center, and mineral extraction became such a economic lucrative activity that the British then got involved. And the British wanted this colony, so they actually went down there and took it from the Dutch. And that was in the 1800s. So you got Dutch influence initially from Europe, then British influence. And actually it was a nasty business. The Dutch and the British fought several nasty wars to take over this place. It ended up being a British colony before it became independent in the 1900s. But nasty business. If you're interested in that history, go look up the Boer Wars, B-O-E-R. But let's get back to South Africa as a whole. It is, I said, the 25th largest country on the planet, but it actually is the 28th largest economy on the planet, too. It's doing quite well. Depending on the source that you look at, 350 to 400 billion in GDP. It is a BRICS country now, the B-R-I-C-S for South Africa, meaning that it's had pretty good, decent to really good growth in the last 10 years. So it's a vibrant economy and a fairly rich one, particularly relatively speaking in Africa, and it's been growing. And more important than that, it's a well-developed, a fully developed economy, meaning it's not just resource-based. They're not just making money off of oil or just making money off of diamonds. They have a lot of industry and technology and service sector work. It is definitely, with no reservations, the most well-developed African economy of them all. And its inclusion as the BRICS is perhaps a little premature, because while it was growing very fast for the last couple of decades, they've kind of stagnated and slacked off a bit here in the last 4 or 5 or 6 years. So it's questionable if they're really going to be in the same category as Brazil or China here for much longer. And it's also questionable that they're in the BRICS category because they used to be the largest economy of Africa. Forever, South Africa was the richest, largest economy in Africa. But they just got bested just this year by Nigeria. So Nigeria is the largest economy now. South Africa is a close second. Having said that, South Africa is still way more developed economy than Nigeria, which is mostly based on oil exports. So South Africa is still seen as a leader within Africa as a whole because of the developed nature of its economy, because of its richness, and also, unlike Nigeria, South Africa has a very high GDP per capita. It's like 11 or 12,000. That may not sound like much to you, but actually it's pretty good in the world. So they're seen as an economic leader, a technology leader, as the country that has the most street cred and power on the global stage, and probably all those things are true. And it's definitely seen as a social leader since South Africa, led the charge for racial equality in defeating apartheid in its state. You don't know much about South Africa, but I bet you've heard of apartheid. That's right. South Africa was the home of this horrifically racist situation for most of the last 100 years. And you also know this Nelson Mandela dude, the guy who single-handedly fought and defeated apartheid and became the first black president of South Africa and a hero to the modern world. A couple things there. Yes, Nelson Mandela is from South Africa. Yes, he fought against apartheid. So did a whole bunch of other people over the course of 100 years. He didn't do it single-handedly. And he certainly was the only African guy you probably have ever even heard of until you took this course. So I'm glad you're starting to diversify, and you probably know Jacob Zuma, the current president of South Africa. But let me say a few things about apartheid, because you think you know apartheid, but you really don't. Apartheid isn't just racism. It wasn't just that white minority, that European colonialists who were in charge, that they had a better situation in South Africa. No. They controlled the entire situation in South Africa. Apartheid was formally established in 1948, and that was after decades, if not centuries, of the whites controlled everything. And they started increasingly passing laws once South Africa became a sovereign state to make sure that the whites continued to control everything. So by 1948, they established this full-fledged across the entire state system called apartheid, legally apartheid. And the translation is, quote unquote, the state of being apart. Apart. You may have heard of Jim Crow laws in America where it was separate but equal. No, 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 no. In Africa, they didn't give a crap about it being equal. It was the whites control everything, and the whites make all the rules, and nobody else has got a say in the matter at all. In terms of the reality check for you, the whites controlled everything, including there were no property rights outside of designated areas for non-whites. So the whites could say, well, we control and own everything we want first. And if there's areas we don't want, we'll tell you what and if and maybe if you non-whites can buy it. So most blacks had no right to property or own a house or anything. They, of course, had no voting rights, no representation in the government whatsoever for non-whites. Segregation in all public spaces, churches, movie theaters, schools, all separate. Separate and not equal, because you can imagine in this scenario, what do you think the white government, how much attention did the white government pay to the situation and how much funding that black schools got? Not much. So it was a very separate and wildly unequal society. Eventually, the black Africans in the state of South Africa, and the colored folks as well, were stripped of citizenship in their entirety. So even though they were living in South Africa, if you weren't white, you actually weren't a South African citizen. What the hell these racist people were thinking of, nobody gets even now. But the local non-whites in South Africa had to carry a passport. They were actually told they had to live in certain sectors of the country at one point, and they had to have a passport to move between the different sectors. Wildly racist, like the most crazy racist thing ever in modern history. And as you can imagine, there was plenty of uprisings and protests internally about this, and people weren't happy. And over the course of the last 100 years, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Africans lost their lives in protest and political protest and sometimes violent protest. And there was internal revolt, but there was also external pressure. The international community looked at South Africa as basically a pariah state. And it's hard for us to imagine it in today's world, especially you younger folks, because you're like, well, South Africa's cool. Nelson Mandela, it's all equal, it's cool. They hosted the World Cup. South Africa is great. Back in the day, back in the apartheid day, they were looked upon like we look at North Korea in today's world. They were a whack-ass, crazy, fringe state that nobody wanted to deal with, nobody traded with. There was pretty much a full international embargo against South African goods. No one wanted to mess with this because of the horrific situation they had created for themselves with apartheid. So given the internal and external pressure, apartheid does eventually start to unravel as we get closer and closer to today's world. And it comes crashing down in 1990 when the white government realizes they cannot keep perpetuating this. You know, you're looking at a couple million people who were supposed to be in control and in charge of 5 or 50 million citizens. It's just preposterous. Who had no voting rights? It's preposterous. So it unraveled. Nelson Mandela, for his part, spent 27 years in jail protesting against the government, and it was jailed for anti-apartheid activities. He was freed in 1993. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. And 1994, a free society came about, and everybody had voting rights, and Nelson Mandela became the first black South African president. Yay! And everybody celebrates, and that's the end of the story. And everybody's happy and all's good now because they're all equal. Well, hold on. Let's get back to our story now to get to the movie. That's not quite the case. Everybody is equal in the law's eyes and in the government's eyes, and everybody has voting rights now, but that has not made for an instantaneous, overnight, economically equal society. And even though it's been 20 years now since apartheid went away and Nelson Mandela was elected the first president, what you're going to see depicted in this film in and around Johannesburg is that very wealth disparity that is very much still in place. So you're going to see Johannesburg in the background. Big city, modern city, great city. The heart and soul city of South Africa. Certainly the economic heart of South Africa. Mostly what you're going to see depicted in the film, though, is Soweto, which is what we call a township. We call it a suburb from this side of the Atlantic, but locally they'd say that's a township. And the townships were planned by the white government, peripheral ghettos. where the evicted non-white people had to live. So 50 years ago, they planned this little city, and you'll see it. It's still there. If you visit South Africa, you'll still see them. They're still there. They're these planned little communities. They're gray cinder block little huts with, corrugated metal roofs on them that are 1 story high, and that's it. And you'll just see big swaths of them. And they were built by the government, and that's where all the non-white people would live. And why would they push non-white people to the edge of the city? Well, because they needed their labor to work in the city, but they didn't want them living in the city. Remember, apartheid was a state of being apart. So these were planned peripheral ghettos, and Soweto is a very famous one, and it's an acronym, S-O-W-E-T-O, S-O, South, W-E, West, T-O, Township. So Soweto Southwest Township. It's a very famous one because there was a ton of anti-apartheid activity there. Nelson Mandela himself wasn't born there, but he lived there for a while. Archbishop Desmond Tutu lived in Soweto for a while. It was always a hotbed of political activity, and at its height probably had 1 to 2 million citizens living in it. So this is a suburb that has 1 to 2 million people living in it. And as often happens on the peripheral edges of cities and of townships, even more kind of ramshackle construction areas crop up with found materials where people who are too poor to even be in those cinder block houses build their own shacks. And so you'll see also depicted in the film the peripheral slums in and around Soweto, which is itself a peripheral planned slum of Johannesburg, where the non-white people live. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself, and we're supposed to start this movie, so let me finish up. Soweto's a quite important place historically. The filmmakers chose this quite intentionally as the scene, the setting for this film. Again, it's all filmed on location. It still looks like that today, even though this film's 10 years old. I've been there. It still pretty much looks the same. You got the big modern city center, and then these peripheral, more slum-type areas. And what you're going to see depicted in the film is the poverty that's still quite rampant in South Africa. Unemployment is through the roof. Social stratification that was started as apartheid is still quite in place, but now it's increasing wealth disparity. Rich people live over here and the poor people live over here. And do pay attention to that during the film, as you'll see the main character, Tsotsi, and his gang at one point go into gated communities that are just a subway ride away from the slum that they live in. It's that type of wealth disparity, ultra rich next to ultra poor, that is defining modern South Africa and is probably the point of this film. Having said that, let's now watch Tsotsi and come back at the end for a quick summary before you go take your quiz. Enjoy the film, Tsotsi.